Hello, welcome to the Comic Book Commentary. I'm Bo Leidig, and as I promised last month during my video on Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles number 5, this week we're going to be starting in on the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles micro series issue number 1, Raphael. So let's zoom in and take a closer look. First published in November of 2011, we start off with a phenomenal cover by David Peterson. There's nothing flashy about this, but I feel like it does a great job of just establishing the idea that this is a purely Raphael story with him, standing up on top of a building, patrolling the streets at night, kind of the lone wolf of the Turtles group, which, this image is very fitting of. I like that a lot. Also, I'm not certain exactly why they went with the term micro series instead of mini series. The only thing I can think of is that while this is a 4-issue series, the Turtles themselves exist in single issue stories instead of like one continuous ongoing story for the most part. Each issue features a solo story that revolves around one individual turtle. So maybe that was their reasoning, or maybe they were just trying to do something a little different. I have no idea. I'll just go ahead and start out by apologizing for some of the names that I'm about to start mispronouncing. Written by Brian Lynch. Art by Franco Uru, perhaps? Colors by Fabio Mantovani. Letters by Chris Mowry. Editor Bobby Curnow or Curnow, not certain. We can see here that this issue has 5 different covers. I have cover A, but there are 4 others that I do not have. 2 of which are Kevin Eastman covers, which are pretty cool. One of which is a Jetpack Comics exclusive. I know nothing about Jetpack Comics. I don't know if it's a single location store or if it's some sort of a service. Either way, they were either tight enough with Kevin Eastman or had enough money to pay to IDW to get their own exclusive cover. The story begins with Raphael and Casey Jones out on patrol. Raphael is thinking through an internal monologue about the situation at hand, and we learn that Raph typically goes out every night on patrol with his brothers. However, Wednesday night he sets aside to go on patrol exclusively with Casey in Casey's neighborhood to try and clean up the crime in his local community. We learn that Casey's neighborhood is pretty rough, and usually there's lots and lots of crime going on there. So Raph feels like it's very important for him to still come back and visit his friend who helped him out in the early issues of this comic and try and help him just work through getting his neighborhood cleaned up and just be there for him in general. We see that they've just immediately dispatched a group of bad guys who were trying to break into a storefront, and Casey even makes a joke that he thinks one of them is about to start crying. After tying up the thugs and calling the police, both Casey and Raph go up to the top of a nearby building and begin to scan for crime once again. However, after about an hour, they don't really see anything, and Raph starts to get a little antsy. However, Casey takes this moment to thank Raph for showing up and hanging out with him, even after he's found his family. He realizes that they probably have a lot of catching up to do, and knows that Raph is taking time out of his otherwise busy schedule to come and fight crime with Casey as a favor to him. Raph, however, says, "Nah, don't worry about it, man. All the good crime's in your neighborhood." However, Casey goes on to ask, what's it like, having a family now all of a sudden and, having to deal with this new idea of being part of something bigger. And Raph kind of just brushes it off, stating, "What are you talking about, man? We got work to do. Let's keep scouting around." He then states that he's going to go and jump to a nearby fire escape to see if there's anything going on the next block. However, Casey continues to press and asks, "Yeah, but what's it like, man? I mean, you have a family that's super supportive and they're all really cool and, mutant ninjas." Raph doesn't seem to understand exactly what Casey's getting at, as he says, "I guess it just feels fine." And then he jumps to the fire escape across the street. Casey just kind of brushes the whole thing off, stating, "Yeah, fine, sure." And we see that Raph starts to question internally, what exactly is Casey getting at, as he seems to be really chatty tonight. and there's criminals that we should be going after, when suddenly the whole thing is interrupted by some nearby gunfire. This, however, bodes more about Casey's home life being so awful that he's genuinely curious about what it's like to have like a loving family who's really cool and is there for you and supportive, as this is something that he's missing in his own life, and it just further goes to illustrate how bad things are for Casey at home. Casey tells Raph to head towards the gunfire as Raph quickly scrambles up the fire escape. Upon making it to the rooftop, he runs to the other side of the building, looks down in the alleyway, and sees two large men with large guns chasing after a mysterious cloaked figure. He notes that the cloaked figure is very fast, as he sees that they are running towards a dead end. As the figure tries to hop over the fence, they are grabbed around the ankle by one of the men, who says, "Not so fast." However, the cloaked figure then lands a very swift and well-placed kick on the chin of one of the pursuers, who we notice now, getting a closer look at, are some familiar faces that you may recognize from previous Turtle series. The other pursuer, who I'm certain everyone watching has already recognized as Rocksteady, as this is in fact the first appearance of Bebop and Rocksteady in the IDW series, manages to land a backhand across the face of the mysterious figure. He then grabs them, stating, "I can hit harder than that, so don't push it." However, Raph jumps down from the rooftop, landing a well-placed kick on Rocksteady's face. Knocking him to the ground, Raph stands over him and says, "I can hit harder too, so how about you push it with me?" At this point, Bebop tries to attack Raphael from behind, which he easily evades. He then grabs Bebop's hand, flips him over, and never one to let off the offensive, jumps on top of him and starts pummeling him. I'm also very happy that this series started out with Bebop and Rocksteady in their human forms instead of their mutated forms. I really appreciate the idea that it's, making a point to show that they started out as just normal humans and then became mutated later on. With Raphael preoccupied, Rocksteady has an opportunity to go for his pistol. He lunges toward it, stating, "You thought one lucky hit was going to take me out of this battle? I'm a juggernaut. I'm a goddamn rhino," which is what we call foreshadowing, folks. However, before he can reach his gun, he is taken out of the fight by Casey Jones, who cracks him across the back of the head with a baseball bat. Casey then asks Raph what he missed, but Raph is actually more worried about the figure that they were pursuing, as he approaches the shadowy figure, stating, "Hey, little guy, are you okay?" However, when the figure removes their hood, everyone is shocked to realize that this is not a human being. This is a mutant Arctic fox. The fox asks Raph, "What are you?" And Raph states, "I was going to say the same thing to you." However, at this point, the fox leaps to her feet and begins to run away. As she starts to escape, Raph states, "Wow, I didn't realize she was a girl." And Casey's like, "Yeah, or an Arctic fox." However, at this point, the fox stops and turns around and says, "Wait a minute, you're not chasing me?" And Raph replies by stating, "No, you're free to go as you please. We really weren't trying to stop you or anything. We were just trying to help you out." The fox then begins to approach the pair, asking, "Are you really not here to hurt me?" However, this starts to frustrate Raphael as he asks her, "Have you not been paying attention at all?" At this point, though, Casey realizes that she's probably scared and tells Raph that instead of bombarding her with a bunch of questions, they need to just start from the beginning and ask her name. The fox responds by telling them that her name is Alopex and that she doesn't remember a whole lot of other things about her life. She has fleeting memories of a time when she lived in the wild and was captured by hunters. The hunters then took her to a lab where the humans in the lab tried to change her, and that there were many other animals there. She then recalls that despite not being the only animal captured, she was indeed the first animal to start to understand what the humans were saying, as we see her overhearing one of the scientists stating, "Genus Alopex is showing the most promise," or Alopex, excuse me. I'll get to that in a moment. She then tells the two that she began to become much smarter at a much faster rate than the scientists realized, and that she was able to use her intelligence and growing strength to escape the lab. However, upon escaping, the scientists sent all manner of martial artists and bounty hunters to track her down and capture her once again. She then asks Raph about himself, and he states, well, my name's Raphael, and that's about all you're going to get. I don't really do the whole origin for origin story. As Alopex looks down at her feet and says, I understand. Now, what I brought up before about Alopex versus Alopex, it's because I looked it up finally. I had been mispronouncing this name for years. Alopex is the correct pronunciation from the ancient Greek word that means fox. The original scientific name for the Arctic fox was in fact Alopex lagopus. However, at some point they decided to change it from a Greek word to a Latin word, at which point the name for the Arctic fox became Vulpes lagopus. And upon learning all these things, my Google history is now filled with all sorts of scientific searches for Arctic fox information, because I wanted to try and go a little bit deeper on this character than anyone was really asking me to do. However, Raph then tells Alopex that he knows 3 other guys who are going to be more than willing to just talk and talk about their origin story. He then tells her that he knows one man in particular who will be more than willing to help her, as Alopex states, you're the first 2 creatures I've ever met who aren't trying to hurt me or eat me. Raph then states, yeah, well, I'm not going to leave you here, as he puts a blindfold around her face. Alopex says, apparently you're not going to trust me either, given the whole blindfold act. However, she does then thank Raph. Raph looks over at Casey, and Casey says, don't worry, I'm going to tie these 2 up and take care of things here. As Raph scrambles up the side of the building, he says to Casey, don't be here when the police show up, there'll be too many questions. Casey says, yeah, don't worry, I'll be long gone. All alone at my house. Yeah. As we once again get a chilling reminder of how horrible Casey's home life is, and that this night out once a week with Raph patrolling the streets is kind of his only respite from just the terrible existence that he has to deal with on a daily basis. Raph continues then to jump across the rooftops, making headway with Alopex over his shoulders, as he asks her, what's going on with this whole lab of yours? We need to try and go there. Alopex states, do we have to go there now? And Raph says, no, but I want to go back there and free all these animals you were telling me about. I want to make sure that we can try and help them. He then tells Alopex that he knows that this whole situation is weird, and that it's going to get weirder because the man that he told her about is actually a giant rat, which he thinks is something that she should know beforehand. However, at this point, as he's running, he starts to realize that something about all of this feels off, that everything just seems a little bit too convenient, and then realizes that something really fishy is going on as he comes to a stop and just says, damn it. At this point, Alopex asks, wait, what's going on? What's wrong? Raph then pulls Alopex off of his shoulders and holds her in his arms as he approaches the edge of the building. He then releases Alopex, dropping her towards the alley below. She screams, what are you doing? As she reaches out and then unleashes her long, powerful claws, which she uses to dig into the bricks on the side of the building and slow her descent. As she gets close to the bottom, she backflips off of the wall, lands on the adjacent wall, kicks off of it, and then lands on her feet. She looks up at Raph, who is now descending the fire escape, and said, so you just saved me so you could drop me? What are you doing? However, Raph responds by stating, I would have caught you if you needed me to, but you didn't, did you? At this point, we see that Alopex becomes far more serious and suddenly asks, when did you figure me out? Now, Raph thinks to himself seconds ago, but he answers her, I knew from the moment I laid eyes on you. Raph then explains to her that he figured because she's an Arctic fox that her sense of hearing and smell must be unrivaled, meaning that even if she's blindfolded, she has a perfect sense of where she is and what her surroundings are. At this point, Alopex unleashes a flurry of shuriken, which Raphael easily dodges. He then tells her that he also figured that she was playing the whole damsel in distress act as a means of gaining a golden ticket to their secret headquarters, or perhaps she's just an errand girl of some sorts. He leaps off the wall and tries to land a kick, which Alopex easily dodges. She then responds with her own counterattack that Raphael blocks with his size. However, this leaves an opening for her to land a swift kick as she tells Raph that he talks too much. Raph then states that if she thinks he talks too much, that she needs to meet his brothers because all they do is yap. However, with his size now on the ground, he squares up and takes this battle more seriously and says, "Fine, we'll do it your way, no more talking." At this point, Raph proves that he is more than a match for Alopex as he lands blow after blow, and we see that she is on the ropes and is perhaps not ready for the skill level that Raphael is displaying. Raph then demands to know who Alopex is working for as he squares up to continue the battle. However, Alopex, realizing that she's a bit outclassed, decides that she's going to make a hasty retreat. She tells Raph that there's no way that she's going to give him any information as she leaps into the air and throws down a flashbang. This blinds Raphael and allows her to escape. However, at this point, Raphael is on really high alert, as seemingly would be the appropriate response for this situation, and decides that he's going to wander about the city for a while to make sure that she's not still following him before he heads home. After he's satisfied that he is indeed not being followed, he rejoins his brothers and gives them the scoop on everything that's happened. Upon hearing this, Leonardo immediately formulates a plan, stating that from this point forward, none of the turtles are going to go out alone. They're always going to work in teams of at least two, and they're not going to go back to Casey's neighborhood anytime soon, because the only reason that Alopex was ever able to formulate this plan in the first place was because she had to have known that Raph kept a really regular schedule going there every single Wednesday night and patrolling the streets, which made him vulnerable. Raphael agrees to this plan, however, later that night immediately breaks several of the rules that Leo set forth, as he returns to Casey's neighborhood to give him the inside scoop of what happened as well. Casey responds by telling Raph that some funny things went on his end as well, because after the police showed up and grabbed Bebop and Rocksteady, they took off, and then suddenly the police cruiser, the two thugs, and the police officers inside disappeared and are now completely unaccounted for, and the NYPD is searching frantically to try and figure out where they went and what happened. Raph then tells Casey that going forward, he and his brothers are going to have to stick close together to make sure that this type of thing doesn't happen again. Casey tells him that he understands and that makes sense, and that from this point forward, he's really going to miss hanging out with Raphael and that he really enjoyed his time with him. However, Raph seems puzzled by this as he tells Casey, "What are you talking about, man? You don't get to walk away from this. I'm dragging you into it." This shocks Casey as Raph tells him, like it or not, going forward, you got brand new brothers. And Casey puts a smile on his face and says, "Well, that's fine. I mean, it's cool, I guess." At this point, Raph seems to understand now what Casey was getting at earlier in the evening as he tells him, "Yeah, but you got to remember that the four of us, we're all real supportive and we're always there for you." And Casey tells him, "Yeah, and you're mutant ninjas to boot." This kind of makes Raph chuckle and he says, "Yeah, that too." We then are transported to an undisclosed location where we see that Alopex has rejoined both Bebop and Rocksteady. Bebop is kind of angry about the way things went down as he tells Alopex, "You didn't have to kick me." However, she argues that she needed to make the whole thing look convincing. At this point, though, Rocksteady interjects, telling her that, at least she and that freak were on equal footing and that he and Bebop have a real excuse for losing this evening. But Alopex tells him, he is a ninja. But Rocksteady tells her that this isn't what he was getting at. What he was talking about is the fact that they're both mutants, and that puts them on a different power level than mere humans. And that he and Bebop are at a point where they want to become mutants as well to even the odds and make sure that the next time they meet up with this guy, it's going to be freak against freak. Bebop then stands up and says, "Yeah, when do we get to change?" However, they are all suddenly interrupted by another figure in the room who says, "Silence, you'll get to change." And on the final page, we see a foot ninja who states, "When the master wills it." Now, this is a super cool way to introduce the idea that the Foot Clan is operating in New York City, as we see our first look at a ninja whose shadow is that of Shredder. This is such a really cool, like, foreboding way to show that Shredder is just over the horizon, after also introducing Bebop and Rocksteady. And in the previous issue of the ongoing series, we just learned about the whole backstory between Oroku Saki and Hamato Yoshi. However, this brings up a lot of questions. For instance, Hamato Yoshi and his 4 sons, aka the Turtles, are all reincarnated, as they were murdered during the feudal period in Japan. But Oroku Saki was not. So it begs the question, how on earth is he here in the 2000s, which is hundreds of years later? We then get an advertisement for the next issue of the micro series, which will be featuring Michelangelo, so keep your eyes peeled for that. I'll be getting to that eventually. We then get several pages of Kevin Eastman's brainstorming for the Alopex character, as we see early renditions of what he planned on making her look like, which is pretty similar to what she ended up looking like. We can see that he went through several different designs for the face paint / face mask that she wears, but also that he very much had a really strong idea of giving her the long claws and all the wraps around her body, and that her overall design changed a little bit from what his original concept was to what we saw in the comic, but not all that much. He kind of nailed it with the first go-round. On the next page, we get a few more concept designs of Alopex's face paint or mask, whichever you want to call it. And we realize that, again, Kevin Eastman really kind of figured out exactly what he wanted the character to be from the get-go, and just kind of added in little extra points of flair, and was kind of brainstorming more about that than the character as a whole. Even pointing out with the whole thing going on here with her shark tooth necklace, that's not really explained, but, you know, it is there, and apparently he has some plan for why she wears it going forward in the story. We then get an advertisement for Cobra Civil War Snake Eyes. This, of course, is tying in to the IDW G.I. Joe series. Now, full disclosure, I've never read any issues of that series. I don't know how good it is. If you did and want to talk about it in the comments below, feel free, because I'd actually like to know a little bit more about it. We then get an advertisement for Rocketeer Adventures from IDW Comics. Now, I want to point out, if you're interested in reading these books, they have literally no tie-in to the Walt Disney picture, The Rocketeer. This is because when Dave Stevens was approached by Disney, or approached Disney himself, he sold the film adaptation rights to Walt Disney, but not the character. So, after the movie was made, he continued to have the rights to make Rocketeer stories and produce Rocketeer memorabilia. It just couldn't have any tie-in to the film. Likewise, Disney could produce sequels to that movie if they wanted to, or, you know, other merchandise based on the film directly, like toys or video games, what have you, but nothing that tied into Dave Stevens' previous works with the Rocketeer. It's, you know, one of those yay American copyright law type of things. But regardless of all that, the important part is that Dave Stevens maintained ownership over the comic book rights and everything he had produced up until that point and after for the comic book, which he ended up leaving to his family, because sadly he died pretty young at the age of 53 in 2008 after losing his battle with cancer. So it even states down here, property of the Stevens Family Trust, which is pretty cool. I'm glad that his family, at least as of 2011, still owned the Rocketeer character and all of the works that Dave Stevens had produced before he died. We then get an advertisement for The Dark Elf is Back, The Legend of Drist. I've never known exactly how you're supposed to say this character's name. I've always said Drist. I could easily be wrong. If I am wrong, feel free to point that out in the comments below, because I'd rather learn how I'm supposed to say this character's name. Now, those of you who have read the novels based on this character and the Dungeons and Dragons lore surrounding him may be wondering if this comic book is just an adaptation of those novels or if it is a standalone story. Well, I'm here to tell you it is in fact a standalone story that ties in with the novels. So if you are looking for some Drizzt story that you've never read before, if you've never heard of these comics, feel free to go out and try and find them, or perhaps get a trade paper and expand on some of the lore that surrounds Drizzt and his adventures. And that was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Micro Series #1 Raphael. Holy crap, that was a mouthful. But it was well worth it, because in my opinion, this is an amazing issue. Obviously this is kind of a mini series, but in a lot of ways it's also kind of a one-shot. These 4 issues about each one of the individual turtles don't have like one overarching story that goes along with them, really. They're more or less just kind of like solo adventures of each turtle. And in my opinion, IDW Publishing really just knocked it out of the park with this first one. The idea that we get this really cool standalone story that's further explaining the friendship between Raphael and Casey Jones, and also introducing 3 characters into the series with Bebop, Rocksteady, and the all-original character who was first introduced in this series, Alopex, the Arctic Fox, is just like amazing that they packed so much into this single issue and managed to pull it off rather splendidly as far as I'm concerned. This is something that's difficult to do, and they kind of navigated it masterfully. Also, I was very pleasantly surprised when I opened up this book to start reading and realized that I did not miscalculate when I was supposed to be starting this micro series. If you watched my episode on issue #5 of the ongoing Ninja Turtles series from IDW, you may recall that I believed that I had gotten the timeline wrong and should have started this micro series prior to issue #5. But as it turns out, I accidentally got it right, because we can see in this issue that Raphael is depicted as having been given his size by Splinter, and the other 3 turtles have their colored masks. These were all, of course, given to them in issue #5 by Splinter, so I managed to pull it off correctly. Hooray! Yay for happy accidents. And, I understand that maybe some people think that this should have been done differently, that these new characters should have been introduced in the ongoing series instead of this micro series, and that trying to just dump 3 new characters all in one issue of something that's not part of the ongoing series directly was maybe kind of a weird choice. But if that's the case, it's okay, because everyone's entitled to their own opinion. If you enjoyed today's video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. And thanks for stopping by. Have a great day.